Thank you, Reena, and thanks everybody for coming. As Reena said, this will be pretty quick, and we're going to hold the questions till the end. Okay, so, and some of us are talking about the different sessions we went to, and some of us are talking, kind of focusing on one session. So I'm one of the ones that's going to focus in particular on one of the sessions that I went to. So the one I'm going to talk about was part of a panel discussion on learner transition. So transition mostly from medical school to residency. And I'm going to talk about an interesting survey that I heard presented about factors that program directors use and they value most in prospective students. And it was a national survey of internal medicine program directors done by a faculty member at the University of Connecticut named Stephen Angus. So the problem that the survey is trying to get its hands around is that there's an increasing number of applicants submitted for all applicant types through the main match. So that includes U.S. medical schools, because there's more medical students with the opening of schools in the last 10 to 15 years. DO applicants are applying to more medical schools, to more medicine residencies, international medicine graduates, so across all types. Despite that, the match rate for U.S. seniors has stayed about the same, so about between 92 and 94% of U.S. seniors match every year. From 2013 to 2016, internal medicine program directors saw a 15% increase in the number of applicants, from about 2,600 per program to about a little over 3,000 per program, which is a lot of applications to go through. And that makes holistic review. Do people know what I mean when I say holistic review? No? Holistic review means that you're not just using metrics, but you're really looking at the whole applicant. Who is the person? Where are they from? What special? Yeah, more qualitative, which takes obviously more time. And that is harder to do when you have more applicants to go through. So Dr. Angus did a survey of program directors of internal medicine. I sent it to every single program in the country, which asked the following: what factors are most important when selecting applicants to interview? Based on this increasing number of applicants, have your recruitment strategies changed? Are programs truly practicing holistic review? And how does contact about an applicant impact invitation decisions? So a lot of times students find themselves in limbo. They've applied to a program, they don't get a rejection, they don't get an acceptance, and time is ticking on. And they reach out to a program saying, hey, I'm still interested in this program, or they ask somebody on their behalf to reach out. So they asked program directors, how influential are these reach outs? Sorry, this is a busy slide, and it might be hard to read, but he got about a 63% response rate, which is not bad for something of this nature. And this is the importance of factors when inviting applicants to interview, okay? So a couple surprises here. One is that the CK score has gotten way more important than I anticipated. So the USMLE Step 2 CK score was the single most important factor for internal medicine program directors when they invite people to interview. Not surprising, USMLE 1 score is up there as well, and just about the same. The medicine clerkship grade, not surprising. The medical school attended, I think that's particularly among medical programs, because program directors kind of know which schools they value. They get to know the program director at that place, and they get to know the culture of that place. Grades and other clerkships, the sub-I grade. I won't go through all these, but the thing that surprised me as well was this one connection tie to area. So what that means is that people are choosing students more who have some sort of geographic tie to the school. So either they grew up there, or they went to school there, or they have a family member there, or they have a partner who's got a job there. Okay, that surprised me a little bit. I've heard that again and again from students, that they're not getting interviews because they have to prove that they really want to go to California or they really want to go to Arizona. But this is the first time I've seen this really quantified like this. In terms of holistic review, a couple things to point out. One is female gender is all the way at the bottom. That isn't that surprising, because I think medicine is pretty equal in terms of male and female applicants. Gold humanism and AOA status were about the same and not ranked super highly, about 55%. And underrepresented minority status, I found a little disappointing that it was only 53% when being considered by program directors. So how has this adjusted recruitment strategies? So about 90% of the program directors said they did indeed see more applicants in the last 3 years, and 60% or so said that they have changed the recruitment strategies, mostly focused around inviting more people to interview, either by inviting more applicants in total, having more interview days, having more applicants per days, but also disturbingly raising our standards on who we invite, turning away applicants without a tie to the region, like I mentioned, and turning away overqualified candidates, which again I've personally seen more so in the last couple of years. So somebody who might be applying to a safety is not getting an interview there because that person doesn't want to give up an interview spot to somebody they don't think is going to come there. Also disappointing was that 42% of program directors were less likely to conduct holistic review. And I think medicine is one of those specialties that tends to be a little bit more holistic in nature than some other specialties. So this was especially disappointing to see. To switch gears, what's the effect of contacting programs if you haven't heard about an interview? Overall, it wasn't that high. The most influential is if the home program director contacts the program director of the place where the student applied. Least was if the student themselves reach out. So conclusions, applicant inflation is leading to more use of filters, less use of holistic review, and change in recruitment strategies. And obviously the limitation is that this was only one specialty and did not broaden to other specialties. And one thing that came up in discussion is, well, what are some ways to fix this? Because the applicants aren't going to go away. They're not going to apply to less programs. There's been some things floated out there is that should we cap the number of programs that students can apply to? I've personally always been against that because I feel like it limits choice. And the other thing is that it's very hard as a student to know what programs to apply to. You know, there's so many of them, and you're also not sure where you stand. You know, what's a safety, what's a reach, that kind of thing. There's not been great data for students to really do comparative shopping. And you know, if they're limited in the number of spots they can apply to, they should really be able to better choose. So one other, and let's talk about this briefly, one other presentation I went to was the NRMP update. And one of the things that came out of that was really interesting is that they are proposing a new tool to help students make those selections based on board data and things like how many clerkship honors they have and things like that. So the NRMP is teaming up with the AAMC and also the USMLE to create a tool that will help students filter and sort a little bit better and sort of gauge where they can apply to. The talk was beta tested this past fall, and the idea is that it's supposed to be launched this spring, although I haven't seen any launch data yet. So hopefully that will come out. There are a couple of school initiatives to try to do this. So last year, UT Southwestern had about 70 schools send their graduating students a survey saying, what were your board scores, how many honors did you get, how many research papers did you have, and where did you get interviews and where did you not get interviews? And they took all that data and made that available to applicants this year. The anecdotal data I've heard so far from students is that the students who are applying into fields with more applicants like peds or medicine or family medicine have found it useful because there's enough data in there to be useful. The smaller fields like ENT or orthopedics or things like that, not so useful because there's just not as much data yet. So anyway, stay tuned. Hopefully this will come out and it will really be a pretty valuable tool in advising our students. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Angel.
All right, hi everyone. I just want to share what my experience has been at the AAMC meeting this past fall. For those of you that may not know, I have been appointed now the national chair for the Group on Student Affairs Committee on Student Diversity Affairs. Woohoo! Go Mount Sinai. So the way the work I'm not quite sure if people are familiar with the AAMC structure, but the way the work gets done at the AAMC is through a group structure. The largest portfolio of work is through the Group of Student Affairs, in which they have several committees, and I start a 3-year term as chair of COSDA. We're focusing on advancing a model of holistic student affairs, really extending the best practice approach of holistic reviewed admissions into the student affairs space. What's exciting is that we are collectively working on that here at Mount Sinai through CMCA, Student Affairs, and Admissions, and it's exciting to sort of really have that opportunity to work here and do it in practice and feed that back up into the AAMC space. In this role, I have the opportunity to be at the liaison to 2 national steering committees. One is on the Group on Diversity and Inclusion, which is a separate portfolio of work in the AAMC, as well as to the National Steering Committee to the Group on Student Affairs. So it's really an opportunity to be intersectional in all of the medical education spaces and advance not only the work of really creating holistic medical education experience, but really have the visibility of Mount Sinai in all those spaces. So I'm excited to represent our school in that regard. I also had the opportunity to be on a panel, one of the speakers for fostering social justice advocacy and activism in academic medicine, and really have the opportunity to share about our longitudinal curriculum on addressing racism and bias in medicine, and talk about the history of the genesis of that work, what we've been doing, and where we're going. As you can imagine, it created a lot of interest, and folks are really interested in learning how we're doing it. So there is a real pressure to publish, disseminate, and we're working on that now. But it was very exciting to be part of a panel of other folks from UCSF and other medical schools taking on developing social justice-oriented curricular content, whether it's around racism and bias, LGBT, and other issues. The other thing I just want to share is that I've attended a few sessions that I note here, but I wanted to just highlight one in particular, which is a report that recently came out by the AAMC in partnership with the American Indian Physician Association called Reshaping the Journey, American Indians and Alaskan Natives in Medicine, which provided an overview of the report. And I just really want to say that, remind us about really the unacceptable underrepresentation of American Indian physicians in medicine. As of 2018, the AAMC data, there are currently 210 American Indian, Native American students enrolled in U.S. medical schools out of a total enrollment of over 89,000. This is only 0.2% of the total medical student population. I know that we have one of those students, maybe more than one, here at Mount Sinai who's of Native American heritage. So we have a couple of those students is what I'm saying, of the 210. And so what's exciting is that I will be attending the National Summit for the American Indian Native American Medical Association meeting, and I will be bringing one of our students of Native American heritage to that student so that she's positioned for professional mentorship and development within that community. It was RIME, which is co-led, or I'm not sure if you have the leadership role, Dr. Karani and RIME, but it was great to see a session on fostering critical consciousness in medical education. It's something that we've been thinking about and doing here with our unconscious bias milestone that we have implemented now going on 4 years. It was completely inspiring to hear Anita Hill at the plenary, and there's video of Michelle Sainté asking a question if anybody's interested. And she made the big screen multiple times, action photos. And also hearing the author of Angela Duckworth, the author of Grit. And so I think it gave us a lot of food for thought in thinking about how we recognize that attribute, not only in our admissions process, but also in our students' experience through their medical education. And then I was in a lot of business meetings given this leadership role, which is new to me, but I'm happy to I just want to make sure that everybody was aware of this opportunity. My leadership role, in case you had particular areas of interest, questions that I should be, that I can communicate to these particular spaces and or, also inquire within and try to get a handle on what's happening in other parts of the medical education community. For example, the group on diversity inclusion is partnering with the group on business affairs. They're having a spring meeting. I will be attending that. That should be a really interesting conversation about how space, strategic planning, space issues, interfaces with diversity and inclusion issues. So I'm happy to report on that. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you.
Okay. So, hi, I'm Valerie. So I am just going to tell you about one talk that I went to. The other stuff that I went to was also quite good. The Native American session and broadening diversity and increasing inclusion was a really wonderful session, so I'm glad that you highlighted that. And I actually had the enormous privilege of being one of the speakers around broadening diversity in the incoming class and in medical school and in the profession, and with an eye towards holistic review and holistic support and inclusion. So that was really a privilege to be a part of. But what I'm talking about today actually is much more concrete and is the new MCAT. So as many of you know, the new MCAT came out in 2015. If you march out the students that took the new MCAT when it became available in 2015, they are now in their third year. So they took boards part 1 this summer. So, as we all know, standardized testing predicts standardized testing. And we have, in medical education, we do have standardized testing, right? We have shelf exams and clerkships. We have boards part 1. Pete just talked about boards 2CK being important for residencies. We have our boards in medicine and OBGYN and whatever. So I wanted to sort of look a little bit and give you the data that was presented to us on this new test. So the new test compared to the old test has the following new additions. Number one, biochemistry, which wasn't tested before, a new section on behavioral sciences, which incorporates sort of psych and sociology, which is, I think, with a good intention to try to get at some of the knowledge and skills around communication and patient care and sort of understanding a little bit more around social determinants of health. And the test in general is a lot more applied, a lot more taking data and applying it than just sort of rote memory of content. A lot of stats in each of the sections, so a little bit making it more applicable to perhaps important things that the education community thinks folks need. So this data set was presented actually at 2 different sessions at the AAMC. So how well did the new scores predict students' academic performance in the first 2 years of medical school? We can't do the first 4 years of medical school because this new test obviously just came out in 2015, and those folks are just at the beginning of their 3rd year, or in the middle of their 3rd year. So what did they look at? They looked at progression to clerkship on time, a national database, and that was a yes or no. Did they progress to clerkships on time? Passing boards part 1, pass-fail national database, and we know that it's not a pass-fail test. I mean, it is a pass-fail test, but the students are very involved in their score. But they looked at pass-fail. They looked at summative performance across pre-clerkships, which was done at a cohort of medical schools that they particularly are working with very closely. So each medical school is different, but they come up with how to sort of look at that data set, like marginal passes or failures or, different attributes at each school, different benchmarks at each school to sort of decide if they are, how their performance is across the pre-clerkship courses. And then they looked at the scores on boards part 1 from the first attempt. Okay, so how well do MCAT scores predict performance on those pass-fail outcomes that I just listed? How well do they predict progression? So it's progression to clerkship and passing boards part 1 on the first attempt. So, but when you look at the MCAT score, it's on a very intuitive 490 to 528 score, because we all would have picked that if we wanted to pick a test, with the median being a 500. And our median score at Sinai is a 517 the last 2 years. And so you can tell that a large cohort of folks are passing boards part 1, national data, entrance with a wide range of scores, progressive clerkships on time, right? So you're beginning to go down around here in the 500 period of scores. Yes? Everyone sees that? Questions? No. Okay.
What's the yellow?
They don't have enough people there to put data.
Oh, okay.
So nationally, 2016 entrants with a wide range of scores passed step 1 exam on the first attempt. So when you start looking at when people are beginning to fail boards part 1 on the first attempt. Now, let me just say, we're not in admissions, and everyone knows we are extraordinarily holistic. This is one small point in how we accept people, right? Their MCAT score. But it is one area. But you can see that scores, people are passing their boards fairly consistently at high rates, even as you go down to fairly lower scores. Although one could argue that there is a difference between 97% of people and 100% of people passing boards. The test is, what the sort of word in the community of admissions is that folks can probably be successful if they get a 500 or above. That said, curriculums across the country are different, and support around the country, learning support and how much teaching goes towards boards is different. And every school is different. So I think the most important thing is knowing your data from your internal data and what puts young people potentially at risk for academic struggles. And as we all know, as educators, that there are a lot of non-academic things that put young people at risk for academic struggle. So it's very complicated and nuanced, but yes, this is the data. So then what about the ones that were not just, yes and no, but were a little bit more complicated outcomes? So how well do the MCAT scores predict performance on the continuous outcomes? Summative performance across pre-clerkships, which was from a cohort of schools, as we said, and scores from the step 1 first attempt. So this is a complicated chart, and is Rob in the room? If I say anything that is embarrassing, just feel free to swoop in and save me. or anything. But basically, the correlation of MCAT total score with the summative performance across pre-clerkship courses, the coefficient was 0.59. So they were related. And for MCAT scores also show medium to large correlation with board's step 1 scores. So not the pass-fail, but the scores themselves at a coefficient of 0.58. So now they went and looked at other standardized testing and how it compares to other standardized testing, such as GMAT or such as the old MCAT, which was the one that they wanted to improve upon, but they didn't end up being that different in prediction from the old MCAT. Okay, so this is the score, passing score of 194, but again, I'm not sure that students necessarily feel that they have met their own expectations of themselves depending on what score they get. So it's really better to talk about the score in some ways than the passing, and then the MCAT score. So as you can see, higher scores are correlate on standard on the MCAT are correlated with higher scores on the board's Part 1. But of course, there are many, many data points that fall out of that actual curve, right? So the data is a little bit more nuanced and complicated. So together, MCAT scores and GPAs provide better information than either score alone, right? So this is MCAT alone with a correlation of 0.56, GPA alone with a correlation of 0.51, and MCAT score and undergraduate GPA with a correlation of 0.68. MCAT scores and undergrad GPAs predicts board's Part 1. Combined, they predict better than either alone. So, what have we learned? Students with a wide range of MCAT scores progress to their clerkships and pass the Step 1 exam at a high rate. MCAT scores and undergraduate GPAs combined predict better than either one alone. MCAT scores are only one signal of students' obvious preparation for medical school. So I hate to be MCAT standardized test driven because it's really a small part of our holistic review. On the other hand, I think it is important to know outcomes data locally and nationally. And to be totally frank, had you asked me if undergrad GPAs predict more success academically, I would have said yes over MCAT. So truthfully, knowing your data is quite important.
So not only have I been taken over, but you have all been taken over too by the LCME, whether you knew that or not. So I'm going to speak about just 2 sessions. One was a group session that was for all schools who are in the reaccreditation cycle. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a specific LCME consultation session that we had where a small handful of us went and really had one-on-one consultation about our reaccreditation process. So for those of you who don't know and have been living under a rock for the last year, we are in our reaccreditation cycle. We are knee-deep in it. LCME is the Liaison Committee on Medical Education, which is the accrediting body for new and established MD programs. It's geared towards schools in which students are geographically located in the U.S. or Canada, so only these schools, and which are operated by universities or medical schools, right? So there are a handful of other organizations that are not included in the LCME process, osteopathic schools, and a number of other entities that are not included in this process, but are engaging in medical education in this country. The structure and infrastructure of that organization, it is a co-sponsored organization that has an AMA, American Medical Association arm, and a AAMC, American Association of Medical Colleges arm. The LCME is a 19-member peer-reviewed panel. It's made up of deans and faculty, students, and public members. We've actually submitted an application for one of our third-year students, rising third-year students, to be on the board at the LCME. The LCME Secretariat are the administrative staff. It's the administrative team led by 2 chairs, or 2 secretariats, I should say, one at the AMA and one at the AAMC. And the survey teams, right, those folks who are going to come onto our campus at the end of October of this year are made up of about 150 faculty members from across the country. In addition, students and what they call members at large who are representative of the general population. So the first session that I'm going to talk about is the session that was a question and answer session from deans who represent a variety of different types of institutions. And that was helpful for us because we as a freestanding medical school are really governed and structured very differently than those institutions that are embedded in a large university system or who are single, Mayo Clinic comes to mind. It's just single medical school and a single hospital embedded in the same space. And so it was quite interesting for us to see, because many of the things that we struggle with here are unique to schools that are formed like us. And it's a lot of information on the slide. I just wanted to highlight kind of what the highbrow questions are, because these are the areas, number one, are high risk to organizations when they go through the LCME reaccreditation, high risk for non-compliance and monitoring status, and also institutions like us that struggle in these areas. So faculty appointments and accountability, right? Here at this institution, faculty are appointed and recruited within the department, not as an institution. And so the rules that govern that process are largely institutional rules that must be complied with. And our institution really has to kind of speak around that topic and discuss it in a way that would represent compliance, but within the context of how we do business here, because we're not going to change the culture of the organization in order to achieve compliance. And so it was really helpful to see how that plays out at different institutions. Also, the roles of decision makers. Again, at our organization, because we're small, the same people are at the table making the decisions, implementing those decisions, teaching the decisions that are made in whatever the curricular environment is. And so it's really hard to kind of tease out what in that structure it helps us and hinders us. Also, interestingly, faculty feedback and career development. Again, because we are a small organization, sometimes that becomes a challenge. I think in larger organizations where there's a wider array of faculty from a variety of backgrounds, offers a different level of engagement for faculty mentorship, career counseling, et cetera. And so we speak to the strength of our smallness and our ability to connect with faculty on a much more intimate basis and create really tailor-made things like we do in the ODI office, where we have very strategic and targeted faculty interventions on their development. And we have kind of a wider, at our Office of Faculty Enrichment and other letters that I don't remember, run by Lakshmi Devi. So for us, speaking to those types of programs and the outcomes and the benefits will be very helpful for us. Also understanding the richness that we experience here, because we are small, because we have contact, because we have forum like this where we can exchange ideas and really have an intellectual community that really makes a difference and can impact change in the medical education environment. It's quite helpful to us, and so it's really in our best interest to speak to this and to speak to these kinds of academic engagements. What was also quite interesting, if I'll go back to see all of the folks that were there, is the people I'm going to say, my bias, right, is that, Penn can pay for everything and they can have every amenity. But organizations like that, frankly, invest less in activities like this, according to them, because they feel like there is more prestige and there's more availability of this kind of mentorship. So I was quite interested and a little fascinated to find out that the Penn organization does not engage in this kind of work. And I'm sure, Reena, you knew that information before I did, but I'm fascinated by things like that when I hear about organizations that I feel like are at the top of the food chain. So the AAMC LCME consultation session that we went to, we were able to identify a number of things that for us were really large questions about our process and understanding what risk factors might be associated with some of the areas that we felt that we were vulnerable in. It was our LCME operations team, which is comprised of Shashi Anand, Margaret Kane, David Muller, myself, and Peter Zweig. And Rainier Soriano was also part of our one-on-one consultation. Some of the areas, just to give you kind of context, some of the areas and questions that came up for us had to do with some of the scores that we get back from student feedback and the impact of those scores. Many of you have seen those data, and so you know that there are certain areas that we struggle with as far as student satisfaction and as far as student feedback. We've gotten some pretty critical feedback over the course of the last number of years and really wanting to understand how those risk factors play into this survey team and how those risk factors play into our ability to be successful in this environment. And of course, they didn't give us too many pearls of wisdom on that, other than to say there are ways for us to be able to balance the perspective of the student by speaking to some of the investment and resources that we've put into areas that student feedback has come back in a negative way. So for instance, I'll give you an example, mistreatment. Compared to the national data, our mistreatment numbers are very high. So students report a high incidence of mistreatment compared to the national data. What we have done here is creating a multi-layered, multi-department initiative that allows our faculty to go into almost every single department, every single clinical department at the very least, and offer grand round sessions, share data, have tools and resources for reporting incidents for students, offer remediation services to faculty who may not really know how to prevent or engage in those conversations on their clerkship rotations. And so to really balance some of the student negative data with information around the resources that we put into those areas will be helpful as we think about what areas we need to be successful and what are the things that for us have been continuous struggles. Another area has to do with the fact that we have 7 member hospitals. None of them were chosen by our medical education curriculum team as ideal sites for training our students, but they are part of our health system, and therefore by default we must send our students there. And so really creating a continuity of experience and longitudinal experiences to ensure that students are getting the same academic and educational foundation at every one of our health system sites. And that obviously is a high-risk area for us because it's almost impossible to do on any level, even just in general engagement of faculty. So for us, that's been an area of risk, and so we were able to really drill down on some of the techniques that we can use in order to demonstrate some of the areas that we needed to achieve compliance. I wanted to give you a quick overview of the structure of the LCME process, just to give you an understanding for those of you who are really not embedded in the process. Our Medical Education Planning Committee, which is MHPE, is the governing body that's overseeing all of the work that we're doing. We have a task force system that is reviewing areas in all of these domains related to our compliance and are going to generate a report by the end of next month so that we can then, at the task force level, create an executive summary that gets submitted to the LCME as part of our accreditation documentation. The students were actively involved in creating what is called the Institutional Student Assessment, which is the student survey required by the LCME process, and students are embedded in every single one of these committees as well. And so this is kind of the governance structure of our LCME reaccreditation process. We also update our activities on our Change Now site, so I encourage you all to visit our Change Now site. It also gives you an insight on our racism and bias initiative, our wellness initiatives as well, but there's also a module for accreditation, so you can follow the committee process, you can follow our reaccreditation status. We highlight subcommittee members and faculty and staff each month, so it's nice to connect with all of you, and hopefully you'll visit the site. Thanks.
So we're going to leave some time for questions. I'm going to go from very, very practical to actually quite theoretical in this portion and link back to something that Angela brought up, which is the efforts from the RIME committee to speak about the work that we're doing in terms now of facilitating critical consciousness. And Angela mentioned that as a phrase and the concept that we are trying to work on that as a school. But as background, I think if you remember these meetings that we've had for the past 2 years, I've kind of tried to highlight what that committee is doing. And RIME, for those of you who haven't been to AAMC, or for those of you who had many years ago, RIME has been very research focused. It is the Research and Medical Education Committee and really is very focused on sort of quant and qual methods and methodology and a very strong focus on methods. And for the past 3 years, our committee has been taking what we have considered a very important journey, and that is to move a little bit away from methodology and to move much more into spaces of creating opportunities for discourse and research around areas that we think are really critically absent and really warrant a focus in medical education research. So we're trying to push and drive more the agenda of topic selection as opposed to the robustness and fixation on the method. And so as a committee, the first year we invited Kamara Jones, who then was the president of the American Public Health Association, to speak to us about racism and bias and how it plays out in health professions education. We then moved last year, I think I talked a little bit here about bringing together a panel. We brought together a panel of students who could speak about the student perspective. We had a clinician who spoke about the perspective of being a man of color in this system and what that meant for him and how that played out in his everyday life as a faculty member. And we had a researcher who's doing cutting edge really work in the area of racism and bias in health professions education, but also in health professions as a whole and the patient experience. And then this year as a committee, we decided to move that forward and say we focused on these individual experiences, but how do we think now about fostering programmatic change at schools? And we kept hearing from our community of stakeholders that they're thinking about going beyond what many schools are doing now, which is sort of naming it or defining words. And how do you move it forward? How do you move this agenda forward to really create what we would call transformational learning? And so we began this RHYME plenary this year with this concept of looking back at the work of Paulo Freire, who was an educationalist from Brazil, who in the 1970s really talked about his criticism of traditional education, which applies very much to today, really. This idea of how you deposit knowledge into a repository or into a person, to the recipient, and how does that really foster intellectual growth? Does it really allow you to be transformed by your learning, or merely just take what's given to you and really not really be moved or changed in a meaningful way? And then use that as the grounding for the work of Jack Mazzaro, who was a sociologist at Columbia, who really is considered the father of work in the area of transformational learning. And he spent his whole life, it's an incredible sort of body of work, but he spent his whole life learning from and working with women who were choosing to re-enter higher education after being out of higher education for a variety of reasons. But they were coming back, and he spent his whole life understanding how those individuals learned and how they were transformed by that learning, coming back into it after a life that basically stopped them from many ways from continuing to learn. And he talked about how transformative learning is really deep, constructive, meaningful learning. And these are things that would resonate with us. It allows us to make our own interpretations and then reinterpret things as we learn more. It results in fundamental change within us and allows us to become critically aware of the assumptions upon which our initial knowledge might have been founded, and then what do we use in our learning to really transform those assumptions and move beyond them. And then the real question we sort of led from this is, are we as a health professions education community fostering transformative learning in what we do in our schools today? So what we know from the literature in terms of transformative learning is that as a learner, I need to be able to connect with my own personal cognitive and emotional experiences, so what I bring to the table. I need to be able to engage in active dialogue and discussion where there is an emotive and affective component, but that my experiences in the past also can come to the table. So it's actual dialogue versus just, sort of information being given to me. And then this ability to, through practice and through experiences, emancipate yourself from some of those previous ideas and really be transformed. And these sort of foundational principles of transformative learning are very key. So how does this link really to critical consciousness, which was our focus from this plenary? That also derived a little bit from Paulo Freire's work. And he spoke about how critical consciousness is a state of understanding how power and difference shape social structure and our interpretations. And in order for us to facilitate critical consciousness, this idea of critical thinking is how do we think clearly and rationally about what to do or what to believe in. And in order for us to be able to critically think, we have to be able to take a critical stance. And you will recognize a critical stance is learners are able to question authority and generate their own ideas to construct meaning. So some of this will resonate with our experiences that we have had with students, this ability to really question and then generate their own ideas. And critical stance, so to be able to allow our learners to take that critical stance, is really the foundation of the teaching approach, which is called critical pedagogy. So how do we as an educator or educators in health profession school allow this to happen? And so critical pedagogy is to think about how do we actively allow for discussions about why some concepts of reality are legitimated, calling out what we see and what we hear and what's permitted in order for us to recognize what is not present and what is not represented and what is not visible. The only way we can do that is by naming those things, and to really question how everyday understandings are produced and lived out. Why are things the way they are? instead of assuming those things just are, why are they that way? And having that opportunity for learners to do that. And so Paulo Freire's work has really stimulated this idea that you have to have this critical pedagogy as an approach to teaching in order to create that transformational deep learning in your learners. So this was all very sort of theoretical, and we tried to ask, are we able to incorporate critical consciousness as a pedagogy in health professions education schools? And that begins with a look inwards as a school. Whose culture is being passed on in our schools? What is the dominant narrative? Does our curriculum reflect the broad realities of power and influence? Probably an undeniable yes, right? And this point we tried to really get across to our audience was that no matter whether you think of it or not, a curriculum is not neutral. It is a cultural and political act. And so as leaders, we need to be very aware of that and sort of take ownership of the fact that what we put out there is by choice and can't be just sort of, well, that's the way it is. We have to understand that there's culture and power and privilege behind what we put out. So how do you actually operationalize something like this as a pedagogy? There is some very good work that is emerging in this area, specifically in health professions education as opposed to education at large. But the work of Hallman and Baker last year talked about these key themes to thinking about critical consciousness in health professions education. The first was this idea of appreciating the context in education and practice, and that is helping our learners understand the context, their own context, and the context of where learning and practice is taking place. This institution, this health system, understanding the context and the context that they bring. The idea of illuminating and changing power and structures. How does power impact the interactions that learners and we have with patients, with our community, with our citizens, right? This idea of actually illuminating that. To move beyond the procedural, and that is not literal procedural, but moving away from the assessment of knowledge, skills, and attitudes, which is very sort of built into us as educators, but this idea of moving into assessment of insights and impact and effects. So how do we really sort of move that pendulum into thinking about the impact, which is that active part? Enacting reflection, which is really fostering students. I love this work because she talks about fostering students to become socially critical, and reflect through a lens of power and structure. And the key to that is that that moment of reflection allows them to then feel compelled to act. It is that process of reflecting through power that helps you kind of compel to act. And then finally, promoting equity and justice to really help your learners see the wider structural, socioeconomic, and political underpinnings that produce and sustain inequalities. So this is emerging work, and we sort of ended with that broad framework and then had 3 panelists present on their work on areas that initially might sort of first blush seem like areas that are pretty controversial in some schools. Some schools are not taking a stand on DACA. They're not admitting students of DACA status. They're not interested in it. And yet, what does that mean? So we had a very strong presentation on a school that has, from its very fabric and mission, built a very robust program of admission and support for DACA students. We then moved into the discussion of firearm violence and firearm screening and education around that area in the context of our political climate, and then the concept of moving the needle forward in terms of transformational learning around LGBTQ health. So I'm going to pause there and give folks an opportunity to ask all our speakers who are still here questions about the presentations.